My name is Josh Rothman. I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, which is a legacy publication founded in the first part of the last century. Um, and I'm incredibly excited today to talk to Divya Siddarth and Audrey Tang about artificial intelligence and democracy, and how it might be good. It might be good. It might work out well if we focus our efforts. Just to briefly, I know you guys probably know all about these guys. But just briefly, Divya is the co-founder and executive director of the Collective Intelligence Project. And at CIP, she leads experiments in using AI to enhance participatory governance and decision-making. And in addition, through projects like WeVal and the Global Dialogues on AI, which survey people from some 70 countries about their hopes and concerns, she aims to help bring AI development into alignment with people from around the world. Audrey Tang, who is Taiwan's first digital minister, is currently its cyber ambassador, right? They're a globally recognized advocate for digital democracy, radical transparency, and citizen-driven governance. They've helped pioneer the use of innovative practical software tools and civic structures that restore trust in democracy by building bridges between people and defending democratic processes. So let me just say personally, I'm incredibly eager to find out more about how AI can help us heal our collective situation, and how we can maybe help AI too in that same process.
Symbiotic.
Yes. So I thought maybe a nice way to start with you, Audrey, would just be to talk about Taiwan and the roots of your work in the Taiwanese situation. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about the situation of democracy in general.
Well, Taiwan is a very young democracy. We got the first presidential election in 1996, which is already after web browsers. We are some of the most connected on the internet, like online screen time people. Already in 2014, there's, I think, more Facebook users than people in Taiwan. And so we were at the very front line when it comes to the parasitic AI, that is the recommendation engine that drives engagement through enragement. In 2014, we had a very high ppm, and I don't mean the parts per million of CO2. I have very high polarization per minute. That is to say, when we scroll in Taiwan, we see a lot of those polarization attacks, generative propaganda, malicious AI swarm, the thing that people are seeing last year. We saw that 10 years ago. According to VDEM, we're the top target for the past 12 years when it comes to malicious influence from foreign powers. And so our trust level went really low amid that high polarization. The approval rating of the President Ma Ying-jeou in 2014 was at 9%, which means that in a country of 24 million, anything he says, 20 million against him. But these people, these 20 million, are themselves very fragmented. Some people want to free China, some people want to be free from China, and there's a lot of internal fight. So much so that we occupied our parliament peacefully for 3 weeks. March 2014 is the Sunflower Movement to protest against the trade deal with Beijing. But unlike pretty much any other Occupy movement around those years, we are demonstrators. We're not just protesters. So we use bridge-making systems, and importantly, we use the idea of citizen assembly and aggregating citizen assembly using the first generation of good old-fashioned AI, aggregating them to show the uncommon ground, to show, despite their vast differences, people still do agree on some issues. For example, cybersecurity evaluation against Huawei and ZTE in our 4G network and many others, so that after 3 weeks, we converged on a set of demands that the Speaker of the Parliament simply say, oh, it's a better idea, so let's just go with it. And that is the victory of the Occupy.
Can I just slow us down a little and ask, can you walk us through what does it mean to use like a technological platform to find common ground between people? Because it sounds like a completely alien concept from anything that we currently experience.
Well, I mean, it is the same algorithm as people here use in community notes, right? It's the bridging algorithm. So a very quick primer. In the system that we built, we don't have a repost or retweet button because the research showed that it naturally leads to polarization as long as you have the dunk button. So we don't have that. And so whether it's an in-person conversation or whether it's an online conversation, you would see a fellow citizen's sentiment about the trade deal or about Uber or about deepfake, anything. And then maybe you like the idea and maybe you don't. So there's upvote and downvote or pass, but there is no retweet or reply. So no room for trolls to grow. And then you see yourself placed among people who feel similarly, and so that you can see the ideological differences. But most importantly, the bridging bonus, the virality, is only given to people who propose idea that gets upvotes from both sides. So just getting the left wing or the right wing support is not enough. You have to win the upwing, the unlikely support from the people who otherwise wouldn't support the same thing.
I think something that's interesting about the Taiwan model. So we met when I was working on COVID policy in the US, which was a total disaster. And when, it's not just that these platforms, we build them to try to find common ground between people on questions of policy, but it also works for like what kinds of applications do we want to build, or how do we do contact tracing, for example. So Taiwan had a very intense contact tracing program, like location sharing with the government, basically, which is something that would be completely unacceptable.
In a zero knowledge way.
Yeah, completely unacceptable here because of just a very low levels of societal trust. And I think the interesting thing about these platforms are not just the technical piece of the bridging algorithms, but what does it mean to create longer trust over time so that you can build up a bunch of these tools and other ways to improve state capacity.
Yeah, we run more than 100 of those bridge making collaborative meetings over 6 years. And so by the time I knew Divya in 2020, the approval rating became more than 70% for our president. So like 9% to 70% growth in just 6 years, just by repeating this idea of finding the division, the polarization, the conflict, and treating them as like fuel or even like geothermal energy. So instead of just volcanic explosions, we turn that into momentum.
I mean, just to focus in on something here, what's wrong with democratic societies? Why are we so unhappy? So there's trust, there's growing distrust, and there's polarization. But then in the term collective intelligence, we're talking about something that's separate or different or additional, which I guess is capacity. It has to do with like generating or finding better ideas than the ones that have been proposed. Divya, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about collective intelligence, what that means, and why those. I mean, I know it's, but like, what is different or additional in that idea beyond just the idea of democratic representation?
Yeah, I think democracy has more of a kind of nervous spine to it. I mean, it has this sense of people are created equal. We want to preserve certain freedoms. Collective intelligence has some of that. I mean, we believe that people should have agency over their futures, but it also has a very strong epistemic component, right? Like broadly, we want to reach better decisions collectively. And a lot of the institutions we have set up are improvements in collective intelligence from what happened before. Markets are a fantastic collective intelligence mechanism. Organizations, corporations are good collective intelligence mechanisms. And the idea of collective intelligence is you can innovate on that directly. Like you don't have to wait till, oh, we emergently come up with better ways to do these things. We can directly try to set up better organizations. We can directly, in the case of our work in Taiwan, set up better ways to do like misinformation detection through collective intelligence. Or on the evals platform you mentioned, we can do evaluation better contextually through including a lot more information from diverse groups and having good mechanisms to push people together. So we can actually have consensus across like a doctor in Bihar that we work with and, a policymaker in Brazil that we work with and say, these people have such different points of information that if we find a point of connection that they both agree on, that is not just like a live, laugh, love point of connection. So something that we come up with sometimes is like, oh, if you do naive collective intelligence, you will get a lot of what one might call like live, laugh, love consensus, where people will be like, we should do things that are good and not do things that are bad. And definitely, I want to be happy. Like, great. And so how do you actually optimize the mechanisms for things that are not just consensus, but interesting is actually a lot of the work. And that's why we try to find not just diverse like populations to work with, but that's where the mechanism kind of problem comes in.
I mean, how much is a sense of diminished capacity? So, like, in other words, like, how much is that a driver of our dissatisfactions? Like, how much is it that so there's problems with our system, which are problems that have to do with, like, say, money and politics. That's a problem in the system where we feel misrepresented. Um, and there are problems with our opinions and with our social networks, which have to do with polarization and other things. And then there's a discourse around progress and a discourse around capacity that has to do with there seem to be a lot of challenges that our governments don't seem to know how to solve or how to talk about in ways that feel connected to the urgency of the challenge. Um, and I guess I'd be curious to know, like, have you found that in this collective intelligence work, innovative solutions are surfaced that wouldn't have been surfaced through a more traditional process?
Yeah, I can take that. So I was just in Stanford for another conference, and we worked with the Stanford Digital Deliberative Democracy Lab on a large scale called Alignment Assembly, a citizens assembly to align AI last year with the CIP. And so the challenge we found is that if you poll people individually, they're all on the extremes, like IMB, NIMBY, right? But if you poll people in small groups, they tend to be like MIMBY. Okay, maybe in my backyard, if you do this, if you do that. And so last year in Taiwan, we saw a surge in deepfake advertisements, specifically the Jensen Huang lookalike. And if you click in Facebook or YouTube in Taiwan, any advertisement featuring Jensen Huang, Jensen actually talks to it. Sounds just like him. Of course, it's not him. It's a deepfake, telling you to get some crypto or some investment advice or something like that, probably running on NVIDIA GPU. And that is the thing that really plague our online ecosystem because small businesses cannot afford to place advertisement against those scammers. But if you pull people individually, they're like, oh, government shouldn't, censor people. We're the most free in the internet freedom in Asia and so on, like complete gridlock. And so we sent SMS text messages literally to 200,000 random numbers around Taiwan, asking one simple question: what should we do about the deepfake ads? And then in rooms of 10, moderated by the Stanford AI, basically they just brainstormed. And a room, for example, say, let's show that all the advertisement are probably scam unless it's digitally signed by Jensen or someone. So that's a good idea.
This is in an online room.
Yes, this is an online room. So like Zoom, right? You talk to 9 other people. And then another room, facilitating again by AI, says, oh, let's make sure that if somebody lost $5 million to an investment scam that's not signed, let's make sure Facebook paid the full liability of $5 million instead of just some random fine. And another room would say, TikTok at the time doesn't have a Taiwan office. So if they ignore the liability, what should we do? Oh, we shouldn't censor them, but we should slow down connection to their video servers. We should throttle them so that their business go to their competitors. None of these are censorship. None of these are content level. So people individually polled. They want the government to never censor anything, and that is still respected. But then we show the legislator these bundle of packages, leave everybody slightly happier, nobody very unhappy, and by July everything is passed. And so this year, if you scroll in Taiwan, just don't see any scam anymore.
So, like, first of all, that's crazy. And then here's the thing that when I've explained these ideas to people, there's often a little bit of resistance there. And then when we were talking ahead of this conversation, Divya, you said something that struck me as relevant to that resistance, which is that you can almost basically not believe that people, like, that if you get 10 random people together in a room, that they're going to be able to talk about these things. There's a sort of default technocratic skepticism of the ability of regular citizens to talk through these things and to surface ideas, and the hyperpolarized social media world that we live in only makes regular people seem more incapable of coming up with ideas. And just to put a point on it, it seems like your experience has not been the case. I mean, I wonder, like, if we could just talk a little bit about the global surveys that you've done and what they've shown about sort of people's attitudes towards participating in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the biggest arguments people will say to us, where we'll sit down and someone will be like, but people are dumb, right? Like, there's no way this is going to work because everyone's not that smart. And I think that's partly because we go to people in the wrong ways often. Like a lot of the global dialogue. So CIP runs this project where we talk to people from over 70 countries partly through this AI mediated platform we've been discussing. And then we also put people into conversation with each other, et cetera. And a lot of the goals of that is to, one, just get a pulse on how people are using and already interacting with the technology that we're all talking about. I think we're basically flying blind in most of the world, right? And I think this is really important. But try to start surfacing ideas in very context specific places, like, oh, something looks very different in South Africa than it does in Bombay. So how do we surface how people are feeling in those places? And it's in a way, I think right before we run the process is when I'm always the most cynical. We've done a ton of logistics leading up to it. You have to make all your hate speech guidelines, so you're thinking really badly about people. And it's right after when the data starts coming in that it's almost always surprising to me, like how specific and nuanced people's responses are, and how much I think there is a delta between like what people tell us just, oh, I trust my chatbots way more than my elected representatives, or like, here are the particular health problems I need someone to be solving, or all of these kinds of things that are very surprising. And it's because I think we tend to first go to people and talk to them about their lived experience. So we don't start with should questions of like, hello, how would you evaluate the next frontier model? Like, that's not, people aren't going to come up with great answers to that. And it's unreasonable that they would, right? But how do we ask both lived experience questions and values questions? I think tends to work very well.
Yeah, people are expert in their own feelings. And also the setting works so that people know that only if they say something that's resonating with the rest of the room, do they get virality. And so people are simply better people when they're around other people.
Yeah. And I think it's also, part of the reason I called the org the Collective Intelligence Project and not the Democracy Project is like there is obviously a room for expertise, right? And a lot of these mechanisms work well if you bring in diverse experts in addition to just not every question is for the public at large. And so I think we also try to say, well, where is the expertise in a lot of these places? And that's often also something we're not doing. Like for the evals project, for example, we are talking to civil society organizations around India that are something of a bridge between people on the ground who often just can't, for various reasons, engage in our processes and, the companies or the governments that we're working with.
So can I zoom us in a little bit on this? People trust their chatbots more than their elected
Oh, yeah.
representatives. Why?
Because they haven't been let down yet. I think it's often the case. So when we ask people, we recently did this big thing on like consciousness and capability attribution. Like, okay, what do you think that you're interacting with? And people will say, here are the kinds of things that I look for and what I think is good. Someone who understands how I'm feeling, someone who gives me good information, something that is reliable, something that seems like it's speaking to me in a way that I want to be spoken to. And then many of those things are much more true for the language models they interact with than for their elected representatives or many other institutions. Like we've asked, so we do a whole kind of trust process, and we asked about research institutions, elected representatives, doctors, public schools, friends and family, all of these kinds of things. And actually, people have much higher trust in chatbots than they do in AI companies. And so there's a very wide delta between the amount of trust people have in
30% difference.
Yeah, a 30% difference. Incredibly consistent. We run these every 2 months around the world, and the numbers have been really replicable, which is actually, if anyone here has run surveys, pretty surprising in and of itself. And yeah, so I think there's just a deficit of trust. And so trust is going to flow into something. And we've built something that has a lot of outward markers of trustworthiness that people tend to gravitate towards. And they also are losing trust in many of the other institutions in their lives. So we can't be shocked by this. And I think in many ways it's concerning, to be clear, but also we need to build a society in which there are trust in institutions, trust in each other, et cetera. Like this is correlated with so many of the societal outcomes we want in terms of like ability to handle a crisis, ability to keep democracy, ability to have economic growth, et cetera. So when we look at the Taiwan example where we went from like very low trust to very high trust in a short period of time, and we think about what did people have trust in that made that possible? Well, they had trust in processes, they had trust in the new technology, et cetera. So while we are concerned, we also spend some time thinking about like how do we use the fact that there is a pool of trust here to actually expand that into other things we want people to be trusting, that we should build those things such that they deserve trust, and we haven't, right? And so how do we do that as opposed to just be like, okay, well, we live in a language model controlled world.
I mean, it's interesting to think about the role that just exposure, proximity, conversation has in trust in these scenarios. So most of us have never met our elected representatives or had a conversation with them of any kind. but we can talk to the chatbot. Online, the social network structure is not really about conversation. But Audrey, what you're describing, where people get together in an online room and they talk, they have conversations, that's a positive type of social interaction that creates a feeling of knowledge.
Conversation networks.
Yeah. So I want to pivot a little bit to talk about AI and alignment and some things in that space. But just to bridge that, so George Packer, who's a journalist in The Atlantic, wrote recently about America's zombie democracy. And it's a big piece that's about a lot of things that are happening in the country now. But it has a part about AI, and he says artificial intelligence promises to do what an authoritarian regime does, take our place. And I think that is how a lot of people perceive and understand AI. And it's also possible that will be. I mean, it's not at all an inaccurate assessment of where things could go. I think if we weren't in this room and I didn't know your work, my sort of prior would be that that's what AI will do. It will tell us what to think. It will, and what you're both doing is exploring how it could elicit thoughts from us, which is a very different sort of concept. So some of those thoughts have to do with alignment. And I guess one of the things I'm trying to that I've learned in the last little while from reading your work is that alignment. We're talking here. We've been talking in our conversation so far about essentially civic technology and civic structures of deliberation or connection or conversation or elicitation that are technologically facilitated. What is the civic aspect of alignment that you're both pursuing?
So first, in the technical sense, many of the alignment work we're talking about today is what's called vertical alignment, making sure that AI or inner alignment, making sure that AI models function in such a way that its principal, it could be a CEO or a leader or a user, really anyone, their preferences are very closely followed by the AI model. That's the kind of classic idea of inner or vertical alignment. But when we're talking about civic, we're talking about something else. We're talking about horizontal alignment. That is to say, a multi-agent setting with human agents, more than human agents, and machine agents. How does machine, instead of just furthering the individual goal of various principles, but actually amplifying their conflict in a kind of zero-sum or a really negative-sum way, how do machines facilitate positive-sum interactions among agents? That's horizontal alignment. And one of the main ways we see horizontal alignment really growing is like from community nodes. Community nodes used to be written by humans, but now more and more nodes are now being drafted by Grok and also other open source models because they open up an API, because they understand that computer nodes on x.com and other places really only work if it's quick enough. If it's debunking, it almost never works. But if it's attached to a viral post in the first hour, like pre-bunking, then it usually works, right? So how to get this time to bridge shorter? Well, they train using reinforcement learning the sort of models that react to how likely your node can get people from both sides to actually see a point with some translation if needed. So if one side say, I don't know, climate justice, and the other side say creation care, you can train a model that see that this is the same underlying idea and write bridging node that bring those together called supernodes, right? So that is a very concrete form of horizontal alignment. If we train AI agents in this way, they're like satisfying, right? They're good enough for some particular community, but they're not trying to optimize for any like model win rates or something in the entire moral universe. They're just trying to make sure that one particular part of the community is healing itself in terms of relational health. So I call it a local kami after the Japanese Shinto idea instead of this Abrahamic superintelligence.
Right. I mean, Divya, could you talk about WeVal a little bit and how that fits into this picture?
Yeah, I mean, I think primarily, so I'm sure lots of people in this room have thoughts about what alignment means, and I'm going to totally sidestep that. But I think we think about a lot of these questions as ecosystemic problems, which means we have to like better align many different nodes in networks to many better things. Like it's not really that simple of a problem. And one of the things that we do for that is the global dialogues, which informs policy. Another thing we do is a lot of these more specific kind of processes around misinformation or election security, which are about trying to help the nation state. And then the WeVal platform is around like evaluations because This is actually something, so we have done a lot of work with the Indian government around like large scale population scale deployments of AI in India, because that's going to happen fairly quickly. Um, and what we have found is many models fail in a lot of obvious ways in indigenous languages, in particular contexts, just in really, really ways that most people in the country would notice very quickly, but are hard to create feedback loops for. So we built this platform called WeVal, where a lot of the communities that we work with can create their own evaluations and kind of make those feedback loops more possible. So let's say, okay, we work with public health chatbots in Bihar. These work by having ASHA workers, which are community health workers paid by the government in India, going to different houses and giving out like advice on basic maternal health, for example. And the government is already building in a lot of language models into this stuff. The Indian government deploys technology very quickly, pros and cons. Therefore, we see a lot of positive, ASHA workers are generally undercapacitated, underpaid. It's really great that a lot more people can get information this way. But there are a lot of language problems. How do we fix this? Well, we have to collect more language data. We have to collect more contextual data. And it's very hard to do that in a top-down way. The government has spent a fair amount of money on this. It's actually a thing that markets also want to solve. I mean, companies spend money on this, and the scale of the problem is such that it is very hard to solve it that way. And so what we want to do is, at the point of contact with the model, can you actually include feedback at that very point and construct all of your improved data sets or your evaluations in that sense? So WeVal is one step for us in trying to make sure that at the point of using the technology, you can also put in feedback then. And I think that's true for a lot of democratic things, right? We separate out our feedback loops from our functionality loops. And generally, in like a well-functioning system, one wouldn't do this. Obviously, there are good reasons to do that, but a lot of what we try to do is, can we add feedback at the point of functionality and therefore improve both at once?
Yeah. So two thoughts, and I want to hear what you think, and then we can do Q&A, I think. So the first is, and I think at this point, every person who reads knows about the attention economy, and it's a really, really familiar idea. And one of the default templates that I know a lot of journalists have drawn on in writing about AI is thinking of it as an attention sink. Like, it's a thing we're going to spend a lot of time using. Whereas what you're doing here is a lot about it's what you, Audrey, call attentiveness, which is the idea that the technology is really a way for the system to attend to individual voices or to the
Right.
voices of
So
community.
attention is placing human in the loop, but it's a AI loop.
Yeah.
And attentiveness is bringing AI into the human loop.
Right. That's a great way of, yeah. And I think one of the most interesting ideas here is that to some extent, to a great extent, AI alignment is a civic problem. It has to do with we're getting information from a diverse range of people about their actual lives so that we know what values matter to real people. And then also that AI is an alignment solution for people because it's a way of bringing their values. This is really about value sharing. Is that seem right to you? And I wonder if you have any thoughts about kind of, we live in a time of extremely fragmented values. Like, I mean, if I could just like that, there's so many ways to talk about why things are so screwed up, but that's one way. Is just to say we live in a time when everyone seems to have fragmented values that are pitted against one another, whether that's companies and employees or voters and people in power or whatever. Like, how do you see let's say we're not going to get zombie democracy, but we're going to get something good. Like, what is the way that you think about the sort of most important principle for you to take away into your organization or into your work if you're not, yeah.
But if you're not,
you're not going to
if you're
solve
not
all
a
the world's
philosophical
problems.
zombie.
Yeah, like I'm a journalist, for example. Like I'm not going to, in what I do, I'm not going to solve all of these problems myself, right? But I write about AI. I want to know, like, what are some of the values that you can use to kind of steer your work, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, there's a longer piece that I wrote and I posted on Let's Run to pretty good feedback called Six Pack of Care. And you can find it at a microsite sixpack.care. But I will be brief. So the values are attentiveness, which is really about empowering people closest to the pain to have a real say in the feedback loop. And it's actually easier than we previously thought. Previously, if you run a survey, first of all, it's kind of expensive to get the random stratified sampling, and then you only ask predefined questions, which means that you can tend to get polarizing answers. But now, aggregating does qualitative questions and feelings about other people's feelings, the meta preferences, turns out it's very cheap now. So it scales like sublinearly, pretty probably constant. And so with new open source tools like the SenseMaker from Google Jigsaw and so on, we're now seeing here in the US, not just California with Engage California or Kentucky with What Could Bowling Green Be, but the real posters such as the Napolitan Institute with Rasmussen, they're now running with Google Jigsaw this idea called We the People, where they choose randomly a few people from each congressional district and kind of just do this continuous group selfie on what people feels like and cut through the illusion of polarization. I think the underlying assumption is that we, the people, are the superintelligence we're looking for, right? We're just under a smoke screen of polarization per minute. And so I think anyone can run such processes using Polis or Frankly or Jigsaw SenseMaker. They're like literally as easy to use as, say, Google Survey.
I'll also say, I mean, values are important, but broadly, there's just a ton of low-hanging fruit in this space, actually. Like, we're really not that good at making collective decisions. It's in some ways, like, quite anyone could improve it. And it really is the case that, even just being able to compress a lot of qualitative information quickly makes this much easier in a ton of different contexts. Things like community notes are extremely, like, the mechanisms behind them are extremely straightforward, right? So I think it is the case that we could improve very quickly. And it's not just in local policymaking. Like, we have been supporting using some of these tools in peace building, like in some of the processes happening in Israel and Palestine or in Yemen. And it is the case that really the bar is very low in terms of how good we are at taking information from different groups of people and trying to create sense out of them. Like, we societally do not do a good job of this. And so in as much as we want to think at a very high level about values and attention, et cetera, like, we really can just do a huge amount by focusing on some area of this problem and just using a very base level of tools and, getting to improve.
It works in journalism too, right? In Japan, they use that in smart news, which is like ground news, and that balances different viewpoints. And some of the people in Japan actually run for office with no political background, like Ano-san, who is 34 years old and already a House of Councilor, like a senator member, and he didn't have a platform. His platform is literally crowdsourced using this kind of Polis platform.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I live in a really small town. It's like 6,000 people, and everyone's always fighting with each other about extremely basic questions, like, should we replace the playing field at the elementary school with a turf field? And the one thing I'm definitely going to do is attempt to persuade people to use some of these tools, where it would maybe make our 6,000 person town, which is like totally divided between Trump and everything. It's like maybe we'll all get along a little better. I think we should open up questions.
I just wanted to ask you about scale. Like, you did this thing where you did this random poll of 100,000 people and then broke them down into groups of 10. Joshua just talked about his town of 6,000. This basically this national scale problems. What's the right scale to roll this out at, or do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, certainly. So in Democracy Next, there is a paper that calls about 5 dimensions of scaling. And the great thing about these tools being so easy to self-service and use and open source actually means that it's easier to scale across than it to scale up. Scaling up requires some capex, but scale across means that if people start using it, like, for a while we say we email each other, but then it becomes we mail each other, right? And so at some point, I think when people say polling, people will start to mean deliberative polling or generative polling or things that require some sort of AI sense making to aggregate qualitatively. And so the right scale, I believe, is to start in like tens of thousands of people level. It's very easy actually to get mayors or the district leaders, and not just the political leaders in Bowling Green. What they did is that they got committed listeners from the local developers and museum curators and people who run volunteer organizations to kind of horizontally pre-commit on whatever people do agree with. I will just do things that are within my purview. And in a 10,000 people situation, it's very easy to get that. You can get that in a couple months. But in 20 million people, not that easy. But if more 10,000 people polities start doing this and open sourcing it, and you can see a red district, a blue district, a purple county, and so on, all gets lower polarization per minute because of this exercise, then it can just organically scale across many different jurisdictions. I think that's the primary way to scale.
Hi, I'm Lauren. Now with Arc Prize Foundation and a few other things. So I was actually on one of the original community notes teams at a tech company, and we worked to get academic validation, and it really was a public-private partnership. So when you're thinking about new models for this kind of work, where do you see like the seeds of innovation? And if you can wave a magic wand and develop new institutions to do this kind of work, what do you think that would look like moving forward?
I mean, I think we tend to see the seeds of innovation often in the private sector, right? Like it is the case that it's easier to experiment and to fail quickly. And that's probably why things like community notes came up on social media platforms. And also, you kind of want to be experimenting in a context where distribution is already solved for. So that's why it's such a delight to work in Taiwan, because there is a lot of infrastructure for like collective input into a solved distribution problem. Like often democracy is kind of a demand side issue. Like you can create great insights, but if there isn't an entity to hold and act on those insights, it's not going to work. And so like even for the scale question, we tend to focus on like who's going to do something about this, and then let's operate at the scale of that entity. So if you can get a large government to do something about it, then great. Like you can operate at a national scale or even a global scale very rarely, but often you want to operate at a different level because that's the only entity that's going to hold the answer. So if I could wave a wand and start an institution, I mean, I think I would. The key is to start hundreds of institutions, right? Like we just need so much more of this, and also it's an experimental problem. I'm looking right through Tyler, who runs at an org called Effective Institutions. You should do this. Yeah, I think like we're excited about things should happen in academia. Sure, we want to see tons of companies start up around these things that can experiment more quickly. We do want to see more governments just be a lot better about this. I mean, again, the low hanging fruit I think is immense. I know you work on AI enabled policymaking. So I think it is the case that this can happen in basically any sector, but we're more likely to see quick experimentation in like the more technically aware and basically like higher capex sectors.
Yeah, I think very quickly, I think one very low-hanging fruit in the policy space is the idea of freedom of movement or mandatory portability. This is something that is really getting bipartisan support. For example, in the state of Utah, they passed a law that says starting next July, if you're a Utah citizen, you want to migrate from, say, TikTok or X.com to, say, True Social or Blue Sky. The old network is then required to keep forwarding new likes, new reaction, new follower to the new network. So just like you switch telco and you can keep your number portability, this basically says that no existing monopoly can lock in any users, and there's no incentive then for enshittification, what Carl Doctor says, but rather there needs to be a race to the top, not to the bottom of the brainstem. And so I think that will naturally mandate that all the information superhighway with an off-ramp, and those off-ramp then become a contextualization layer across all the different social networks. And we're now seeing very similar things like human context protocol and so on when it comes to the human AI agent interoperable contextual protocol that can probably power the infrastructure layer of the agentic economy.
You sort of started to answer my question at the very end before the Q&A started, where you were talking about getting adoption in smaller communities and districts. And it feels to me like that really is the thing, right? How do you both persuade people, especially in a very divided district, that it's worth participating in this and that they will be heard, and persuade the leaders, the policy people, the people who actually have the influence, that it is worth listening and paying attention? I don't know. Could you talk a little bit more about how that actually happens? And then, sort of the end point of that is, how do you get that to the federal level? How do you get members of Congress to seriously take this kind of thing seriously?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's essentially a question of political strategy. What we have found working really is to find something that is like so clearly nonpartisan that neither parties have a great record in resolving, and the issue is fundamentally about bits and not atoms. That is to say, it is fundamentally a common knowledge problem. It can be solved if everybody knows that everybody knows something, right? And so one good example was the example we initially worked with Gavin Newsom here and Jennifer, his first partner, is the issue of teenage screen time, especially in schools, but also over-reliance on social media and companion AI. And this is something that is a emerging issue, that's a completely bits-based issue, and people just don't have very good idea like how to resolve this in either party, right? And so the idea that we planned was that we just randomly poll teenagers here in California. It won't be something about them without them. It would just be their idea. And then we run those ideas into a equally representative sample of parents. And if both agree, then the Newsoms can pre-commit that we will just do whatever, right? That the kids and the parents all agree on. Maybe they agree on the Taiwan model, where in school we give kids very large screens, but we ban very small screens. Maybe that's a good idea. Or maybe there's some other good idea involving grayscale screens or whatever, right? But on the day of launch, though, we didn't launch because wildfire happened in Eaton and Palisade. And then the platform Engage California was pivoted to talk about like burying utility lines and other wildfire recovery issues, which is also nonpartisan, right? And so I think the point is that we need to get the infrastructure ready. We're now working to write it into the statute to make it a kind of permanent part of the state bureaucracy, basically. And then the state employees do not have to pay the cybersecurity auditing cost or whatever when the next issue that looks like the issue I just described comes up. And then they can simply say, oh, let's just ask the people, or people can start a citizen initiative of that effort, right? So I think the point here is just to lower the first initial transaction cost by having the larger polity, like state level, absorb the infrastructure cost. And then we just empower the communities of 10,000 people or so to just default on this kind of way instead of running a survey with the same amount of time and money as running a survey, but produce much more generative and transformative results.
I think it's also the case that you want to take advantage of actual political competition, and it's much harder when that doesn't exist. So, like, the reason this has worked well in Japan is because there are many minority parties and it's difficult to form a coalition. And so there is actual stakes to being responsive to people. And when that's not the case, it's much harder. So it's basically like a classic competition monopoly problem as well, where when there isn't an incentive to improve your behavior, there isn't any feedback loop, then we find it much harder to work in those circumstances. Even then, like, monopolies can be persuaded to work better if you can show them it's working by their own incentives, right? So the LA wildfire thing, many politicians in California have something riding on like their response to that, seeing it go well. And so even in that case, you can make it work. But I think it is much easier to start in contexts where there is already a feedback loop around like political competition, basically.
Thanks very much. Building on the question we just heard, once you've got kind of members of Congress brought in, you then pass some kind of law, and then there's the implementation stage. And it seems like a lot of doing this kind of stuff well depends on really effective implementation by the state. If it is something the way that this kind of state is leading, and that seems like a really difficult problem because people have to trust, not just have a generalized trust, but they have to trust that actually things are going to happen and the technology is not going to fail. It's actually going to work. And it seems right now there's a kind of chicken and egg problem where like people don't trust the state, so they don't want to give it the power and resources necessary to implement things like that. And Audrey, you mentioned the idea of like, throttling, I think it was TikTok, right? The idea of that happening in the US, I think like half the country is going to find that vaguely terrifying, and the other half of the country might be like, yeah, great, let's throttle our enemies, and that'll switch whoever's in power. So it seems like there's a real question of like state capacity and the trust in the state to execute that capacity in order for this to go from they're bought in to make it work. So I'd be interested to hear you comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with most chicken and egg problems, you just have to do both things at once, right? And I think that's definitely the case here. We talked about trying to work with the institution that has the capacity to execute, because it is the case that if you run a bunch of processes and then nothing ever happens, people's trust will tank, and rightly so. And so when we do processes, at least we work backwards from like who has the capacity to do something about it. Only when that happens will we even run the process. So even for the alignment assemblies, for each of them, we partnered with an AI company or like with a particular policymaking entity to make sure that we weren't just asking people questions that they would then see no feedback loop close on. And that's one way to do it, where you're like taking advantage of where the capacity already exists. The better way to do it would be to both improve the capacity and the deliberative potential. And I think that is something that can happen. I mean, I think the work in Japan is a lot like that. I think some of the work in India is like that, but I would not say we have done a lot of work necessarily outside of California on state capacity in the US.
This might be a strange question, but I was talking to someone recently who told me they were trying to build some kind of tool where it's as if you're kind of polling digital people. So
Yes.
the idea is that you
In silico deliberation.
okay, great. Hopefully you get the same result that you would get from a more expensive, more time-consuming poll. You can imagine this could be very attractive if it really works. Something tells me this doesn't, fill your hearts with excitement. But I'm interested just to know if you have thoughts on the difference between, if this were possible, between using one of these tools and a process which, involves real people actually engaging in the deliberative process.
Well, it does work to replace traditional survey, those individual to individual survey, to elicit the preferences of you when you are not around other people. This can do amazingly well. But the effect of trying to use this in place of civic deliberation, which is after all about getting people to change their minds and generate better ideas in a brainstorming fashion, would be like, I don't know, sending your robots to the gym to lift the weights for you. I'm sure it's very impressive. You can lift a lot of weights with other robots. But at the end of the day, the civic muscle doesn't grow. You don't form new relationships. Those relationships can actually ameliorate most of the polarization attack even 1 year after such civic conversations. And to run it entirely through in silico digital twins not only missed the chance of actually eliciting meta preferences, but also it reduced the ability for the relational health to defend against the epistemic virus, that is to say, the polarization attack. So I don't really see why you would want to use this, because even the conversation network run today is very cheap now. So there's actually not a lot of cost reason why not to actually include it with real people.
Yeah, broadly, I agree. I mean, I think there is absolutely a role for, let's say, digital twins or in silico deliberation in a context where people are interacting a lot through agents anyway. Like, you do want people to be represented by something they have control over. This may not be the default path. And you also want people to be evaluating those things, because likely a company is going to be building those. And if you have like a Salesforce.com personal agent that's doing democracy for you, like, we've got a lot of questions, right? So I think it is important to understand like what evaluating a digital twin even looks like, and that's something that you want people to have control over. It's a technical problem. It's an interesting one. I don't think it fills my heart with joy necessarily, but I have cautious interest and optimism about it. But I think, to Audrey's point, it's kind of a different thing from trying to like increasing trust in society. Although even then, I think you have like process and outcome legitimacy, right? So like to an extent, if this produces better decisions for people that work better, like that is something I would broadly be in favor of, and still say it's just a different problem, but let's solve that problem too.
Right, and I was just in New York a couple of weeks ago to spend time with a bunch of nuclear security people, and they say that there could be a two-tier thing, right? The unclassified part, we do a normal civic assembly, and then we elicit preference from it to train digital twin, and then we expose them in a trusted execution environment to the confidential information that, you literally kill those agents after they're exposed of that information. But you still have some modicum of democratic control over like very high stake negotiation with confidential information, but with a way that doesn't really endanger the people involved. So I think this two-tier thing may have something to go for it.
I think we should end on that incredibly futuristic sounding note.
Not that
Really
futuristic.
fascinating. Thank you both. This was a really interesting and hopeful conversation. And I think you guys will be...
Thank you.
You'll both be outside for a little bit, I think, to talk for anyone who wants to come outside. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Live long and prosper.